The call came on a Thursday morning, cold, clinical, delivered without ceremony. A nurse's voice on the other end asked for a man named Lior Martin. His mother, Sophie, had been admitted unconscious. No one else could be reached. No one else was listed. Only him. Only the son she hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. Lior stood in his small apartment, the air thick with the silence of a life lived on principle, on self-preservation, on boundaries built not from pride, but from survival. He'd left that house not in anger, but in grief, the kind that follows betrayal, dressed in a mother's smile. And now the very woman who had told him, "You're making this family harder to hold together," was alone, needing someone to hold her life in place. And it had to be him. He didn't say yes. He didn't say anything. He just listened. And then he went to the hospital. There were no warm reunions, no tears, no dramatic apologies waiting by the bedside. Just machines, sterile sheets, and a clipboard bearing a single legal truth. Lior Emile Martin, next of kin, a name she had once tried to erase from every photo frame in the living room. To understand why this moment mattered, you'd have to go back to a living room where Lior had once watched cartoons on the floor, his head resting against his father's knee. That world died the day his father, Emile, never came home. A scaffolding accident, a news report, a closed casket. After that, the world inside their house quietly shifted, and Sophie began building a new one without asking Lior if he wanted to be part of it. Mark moved in 6 months later, with his 2 children. They were loud, entitled. They ran through the halls with muddy shoes and demands. Lior was told to share, to adapt, to sacrifice. His room was raided, his belongings misplaced. His framed photo with Emile, the last one ever taken, cracked beyond repair after being used as a toy shield. When he cried, Sophie said, "They didn't mean to. They're just kids." But Lior wasn't angry at the kids. He was heartbroken by the silence in his mother's defense. Not once did she say that photo mattered. Not once did she tell Mark he's still grieving. She only ever said, "You're too sensitive. You need to grow up." When Lior came out as gay at 16, her first response wasn't shock. It was caution. "Mark doesn't need to know. Neither do the little ones. Just be careful." "Okay." She said it with a gentle smile, like she was protecting him, but it felt like shame. It felt like erasure. So he packed a bag and moved in with Raymond, his paternal grandfather, the last person who spoke Emile's name with warmth. There, for the first time in years, Lior heard stories of who his father really was. A man who skipped meals to save for Lior's piano lessons, who repaired other people's homes for free, who had left behind a journal one Raymond kept safe. Lior didn't return Sophie's calls. Not when she left voicemails begging him to come home. Not when Mark accused him of breaking the family. Not even when she said she was sorry. He had learned that sometimes. Survival meant silence. That love unacknowledged became a wound too deep to carry back into the same house. But now, lying pale beneath fluorescent lights, Sophie had no one else. Mark had moved abroad. His children were too young. The only name on file, the only one that mattered when it came to matters of life or death, was the one she once told to just stop making things difficult. Lior stood beside her bed, journal clutched under his arm. He hadn't decided yet. He hadn't signed. He hadn't spoken. But he had come. And in that quiet moment, it was no longer about what she had done to him, but about what his father had once done for her. If this story resonates with you, follow us for more true-to-heart storytelling. This is Heart Stories, where unheard voices become unforgettable. The first time Lior felt invisible in his own home wasn't when Mark moved in. It was earlier, quieter, more gradual, like dust settling over a photo no one remembers to clean. It began with the rearrangement of the living room. Sophie had taken down the large framed picture of Emile that used to hang above the fireplace. It had always been there, not just as a portrait, but as a kind of guardian. Emile in his construction uniform, holding Lior high on his shoulder, both of them squinting into the sun. It was replaced one day with a new canvas, a family photo taken at a park. Mark with his two children, Sophie in a bright summer dress, Lior, stiff, eyes clouded in the background. He hadn't smiled that day, and no one asked why. What followed were the subtle edits of a life being rewritten. The bathroom cabinet now held children's toothpaste and rubber ducks. The hallway once covered in Lior's school certificates was now an art gallery of crayon stick figures signed Ava and Leo. His room, his only sanctuary, became an extension of someone else's childhood. It started with, "We just need to store a few things in your closet." Then came, "Can the little ones play here while we clean?" And finally, "You can sleep on the couch tonight." Ava has a fever and needs the space. But the real rupture came on an ordinary Tuesday. Lior came home to find his door open, his books scattered, his laundry overturned. A puddle unmistakable and sour had soaked through his pile of folded clothes. Ava had wet herself, and no one had cleaned it. The bed sheets he had just changed were crumpled on the floor. His office chair was scratched. In the center of it all, the last surviving photo of him and Emil, which had sat beside his desk for years, lay face down. The glass was cracked, the frame chipped. His name, signed in faded blue ink by Emil on the back, was smudged. Sophie stood outside the room, not with apology, but with excuse. "They're just kids. They don't understand boundaries yet." Mark added, "You're older. You should know how to share." But Lior didn't want to share grief. He didn't want to share silence. He didn't want to negotiate his way into being seen. He packed a bag that night. He walked past the family dinner, past the television playing cartoons, past the picture frame above the fireplace that still showed a forced smile. Sophie didn't stop him. She just whispered, "You're being dramatic." When he arrived at Raymond's, the old man didn't ask questions. He only said, "You look like your father when he'd been fighting too long." In Raymond's home, Emil was still present. There were photos untouched and reverent. His father's jacket still hung on the back of a door. Lior would often sit beside it late at night, letting his fingers run along the worn fabric. There, he found quiet that didn't feel like punishment. He found memories that hadn't been rewritten. And most of all, he found the journal. It was hidden inside a box of Emil's belongings that Sophie had never claimed. Pages filled with uneven handwriting, thoughts scribbled between jobs, lists of grocery prices, sketches of furniture ideas. But woven between the ordinary were entries about Lior. Lior asked why the stars move. I told him maybe they're dancing. He cried today, said he didn't want to go to school, said he wasn't like the others. I told him he was more. I hope he never forgets I built this house around his laugh. Lior didn't cry when he read the journal. He sat still, and something settled inside him, like a truth returning home. In the years that followed, he built a quiet life. He studied, worked, stayed close to Raymond until the day the old man passed. At the funeral, Sophie came late, stood in the back, and left early. She didn't say anything to Lior, but even in her silence, she managed to echo that word, ungrateful. She said it to an aunt. She said it to Mark. She said it to herself when explaining why Lior had disappeared from their Christmas cards. But now, in that hospital bed, Sophie had no one else to say it to, just her son, the one she once told to make space for the real children. And he had made space, not just in a house, but in his heart. Enough space to hold the ache, the loss, and the refusal to become invisible again. And still, Lior hadn't signed. Not yet. The journal sat on the sterile tray table beside the hospital bed, its brown leather cover worn and smooth from years of fingers thumbing through memories. Lior had brought it not as a gesture of nostalgia, but as a witness, a quiet testimony to all the moments his mother had erased, rewritten, or conveniently forgotten. Sophie had been unconscious for nearly 2 days. Machines hummed around her, keeping time like a clock counting backward. Lior stayed in the chair beside her bed, upright, arms crossed, unreadable. Doctors passed by with updates, but none seemed to know what to say to the son who hadn't been mentioned in years, the son who still bore her last name. Not because he wanted to, but because he hadn't yet found the strength to change it. At night, when the nurses dimmed the lights and the halls fell quiet, he would open the journal and read softly. Not to her, not for her. But for the boy, he used to be the one who had once sat in the dark wondering if he'd done something wrong. He started with entries from the year before Emil died. Sophie's tired lately. I know the bills are heavy, but I'd rather she rest than smile through clenched teeth. Lior asked if I'd still be around when he grew up. I told him, always, even if he can't see me. He had once believed that some love's outlived breath, that promises whispered over bedtime stories held weight even after death. But after Emil was gone, Sophie had turned those pages inward, locking away not only his father's memory, but the version of Lior that still believed she could love without condition. Sophie stirred on the third morning. A blink, a faint sound caught in her throat. When her eyes opened, they didn't search for him. They wandered, confused, dull from medication. Lior didn't say a word. He watched, waited. When she finally registered him, her lips parted, but no words came. Perhaps she expected a rush to her side, or maybe an embrace, or tears, or forgiveness in bloom. But all she found was a man who had grown from silence, who had carved his strength in absence. The nurse came in with a clipboard and gestured for him to follow. Down the hallway, into a private consultation room, a standard update, stable, but fragile. They needed a decision. Sophie was listed as not having a medical proxy beyond her son. Legally, ethically, emotionally, it all pointed back to Lior. He looked down at the form, at the box waiting for his signature, and for the first time, he spoke. She has another family. He said, Mark, the kids. The nurse hesitated, but none are legally immediate, and none are listed. Only you, only him. The afterthought, the inconvenience, the emotional burden she had tucked into corners and kept out of sight. When he returned to the room, Sophie had dozed off again. He sat beside her, opened the journal, and read the final entry Emil had ever written. The date was 2 days before the accident. Sometimes I worry I've poured too much of myself into making this life stable. I hope Sophie remembers that every wall I repaired, every overtime shift I worked, was so she and Lior could breathe freely. I hope she never forgets how much she is loved. And I hope she tells him, I'm proud. She hadn't, not once in the quiet. Lior's throat tightened, not with tears, but with a resolve that had been building since the day he walked away. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folded envelope. It was yellowed, frayed at the edges, but still sealed. Raymond had once given it to him and said, "Your father never got to give her this. Maybe one day you'll know what to do with it." Lior placed the envelope on Sophie's bedside. Then he stood and walked toward the window, pressing his hand against the cool glass. Outside, the city moved as if nothing was changing, as if lives weren't being rewritten every hour inside rooms just like this one. He turned back, and for the first time, he spoke directly to her. Not loud, not angry, but clear. "You didn't lose me because I was hard to love," he said. "You lost me because you chose a version of family that didn't include who I really was." She didn't respond, couldn't, but Lior didn't need her to. He had the journal. He had his father's words. And he had something Sophie could never take back, the knowledge that her silence had written her own distance. He left the room, not because he was abandoning her, but because sometimes dignity comes from not staying where you were never truly welcome. The form remained unsigned, not out of cruelty, but because decisions that hold life in the balance should be made by those who remember how much that life once meant. And right now, she needed to sit with everything she'd forgotten. The hospital room remained quiet, save for the steady pulse of the monitor. Sophie lay still, her face pale, her breath mechanical, and beside her, untouched, was the envelope Lior had left, the final words of a husband she'd long ago folded away in the drawer of her mind, alongside the wedding ring she no longer wore. Lior hadn't returned for days. He hadn't signed the form. He hadn't sent flowers or called to check in. But he hadn't disappeared either. His name still sat on every chart, every clipboard, every decision tree the hospital had constructed for the sake of protocol. He was still the one they called, not because of sentiment, but because of blood. Back in his apartment, Lior sat on the floor, legs drawn to his chest, surrounded by boxes he had never fully unpacked. Among them, a shoebox filled with remnants of a childhood carefully salvaged from the ruins, a crumpled birthday card written in Emil's handwriting, an old flashlight they'd used on backyard night adventures, a napkin sketch of a birdhouse Emil had once promised they'd build together, a promise interrupted by the snap of scaffold metal. He didn't want to go back, not to the hospital, not to Sophie, not even to the version of himself that still secretly hoped she would call and say, "I remember now. I see you now." That boy had waited long enough. But on the 5th day, the hospital called again. Her condition had worsened, not critical, but unsteady. And still, no one else had stepped forward. Mark was unreachable. The children were with their biological mother. Legally, ethically, medically, the system kept turning to him. Lior walked the same hallway once more, the sounds of distant beeping and low voices echoing against the sterile walls. When he entered the room, a nurse looked up with a soft nod, then left. He was alone with her again, except this time the envelope had been opened. The paper trembled in her hand. Sophie had read the letter. Her eyes were red not from tears, but from something deeper, something breaking loose after years of repression. She didn't say anything at first. Her lips parted as if to form words, but then closed again. Shame is rarely loud. It whispers. It chokes. Lior didn't speak either. He simply sat down. The journal rested on his lap. "I never wanted you to hate me," she whispered. Her voice was weaker than he remembered. But what stunned him wasn't the words. It was the fact that she'd said anything at all. "I don't hate you," he answered. His voice was level, quiet. "But I know you hated the part of me you didn't want others to see." Sophie turned her head, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. "I didn't know how to be a mother to someone like you. Not after he died. Not after everything changed." Lior looked at her, then truly looked at her. The same woman who had once kissed his scraped knees. The same woman who later told him to tone it down, to act normal, to keep quiet. And now, here she was, asking for something that could no longer be given the way she imagined a do-over. "Dad didn't change," Lior said softly. "You did." She flinched. "He wrote that letter to remind you who he was. But it wasn't for you. It was always meant for me. You just never gave it to me." Sophie's eyes welled. She reached toward him, but Lior didn't move. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. "I didn't come here to fix what's broken," he said. "I came to make sure you knew it was never me who needed to be different." Silence hung between them, thick, undeniable. "I was scared," she said, voice cracking, "of how people would look at him, of what Mark would say, of what others would think if they knew my son was like that, gay." Lior said calmly. "Say it." She hesitated. "Say it," he repeated, not harshly, but with a weight that demanded truth. "My son is gay," she whispered. He nodded, slowly. "Now you've said it out loud." And nothing broke. No one left. The world didn't end, just like it wouldn't have back then if you'd chosen to love me fully instead of partially. She wept, not loudly, not for show, but for the years she couldn't get back, for the much she'd called sensitive, selfish, difficult, for the birthdays she'd skipped, the photos she'd replaced, the silence she'd chosen over and over. Lior stood, walked to the window again, as he had days earlier, and then he said, "I signed the papers this morning. You'll be discharged in a few days. There's a care plan waiting. I made sure everything's covered." Sophie looked up, confused. "You signed?" He turned back, voice steady. I didn't do it because you're my mother. I did it because he would have wanted you to live, not to fix things, but to remember. And maybe one day, to say his name without flinching. Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but Lior was already walking to the door. I'll come back, he said. Not for you, but for him. And then he was gone, leaving behind a woman now forced to face herself not as a mother to an ungrateful stepson, but as someone who had once been deeply loved by a man she'd never truly honored. 3 months passed. Autumn had started to drape itself over the city, blanketing the streets in brittle leaves and early shadows. Lior walked quietly along the sidewalk, a bouquet of white asters in hand, not because they were Sophie's favorite, but because they had been Emil's. He had once told Lior that they were the flowers he gave Sophie on the day they moved into their first apartment. They're simple, he said, but they don't ask for much. They just last. The hospital had discharged Sophie after 2 weeks of recovery. She had returned not to Mark's house, their blended family had since dissolved, but to a modest apartment not far from where she used to live with Emil. She lived alone now. Her calls to Lior were sparse, tentative, She never asked for forgiveness, and Lior never offered it. But he answered when she called, and sometimes that was enough. He rang the bell and waited. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman smaller than he remembered, her hair thinner, her voice more careful. You came, she said. I told you I would. Lior replied, stepping inside. The apartment was quiet, no children's toys, no framed photos of forced family outings. On a small table by the window sat the journal Emil's, its pages now marked with soft blue tabs. Beside it was the envelope, still unfolded. The letter creased and worn, as if it had been read again and again. They didn't speak much. They sat by the window. She made tea. He declined. She showed him a small collection of letters she had written, but never sent to Emil, to Lior, to herself. I don't expect anything from you, she said, eyes fixed on her hands. I just wanted you to know I remember now, and I say his name, out loud, every morning. Lior nodded. When he stood to leave, he placed the flowers in a jar of water by the window. Before walking out the door, he paused, then said without turning back, I never stopped being his son, even when you stopped being my mother. She closed her eyes, nodded once, and didn't try to stop him. Outside, the wind picked up. Lior zipped his coat and exhaled. Not from anger, not from sorrow, but from the kind of weight that finally leaves when the past no longer owns you. That night, he sat alone in his apartment. A photo of Emil now hung on the wall, not cracked, not tucked away, but centered. Beneath it, the journal rested, closed. He had finished reading it, every word, every line, every promise. And in the silence, Lior whispered, I kept my word. I came back, but only for you. What would you do if the only person who finally acknowledged you was the one who had once erased you? Tell us in the comments your story matters. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more real, raw, and redemptive stories that speak the truths no one else dares to say.